let's pick heart disease, right? Because if you start polling doctors right now, and doctors are supposed to know a lot about this, most of them still think that cholesterol causes heart disease, even though that argument was disproven more than 30 years ago, right? And so how is it that the people who are actually supposed to know the most about the problem never got the memo that 30 years ago, the entire field kind of flipped, and they are more than 30 years behind the curve? The reason is, if you just Google what are the articles being written about heart disease, they're all over the place. Like, very few of them just focus on the one thing that is obviously true. Most of them try to make some esoteric connection that 50% of the people will agree with, 50% will disagree on. So people will start arguing, sharing it with each other, being outraged, and therefore lots of clicks.
All right, so let me say a few things to that, because I think this is really intriguing. Personally, like, I think as you start to zoom out from it and get philosophical, like I said we would, it starts to get into a conversation about democratization, we can't say that word, democracy, or the democratization of information,
right,
as well as kind of free market and capitalism. And the reason I say that is, in some ways, the reason we have so much more information today is because we have democratized it. We have allowed it through the internet and other things where anybody could write that article. Now, sure, there are still like scientific journals and medical journals that have a little more prestige, but because there's so much out there, it's hard to even tell which one is the credible one, which one isn't, to your point, right? And that's an interesting thing, because in many ways, democracy is a good thing. Giving more people a voice, there's a lot of positives in that, right? And that ties to the next piece, kind of the free market capitalism aspect of it, because in theory, that's the solution to that. You allow anybody to have a voice, but let the free market play out. In theory, the best voices should win. Those are the ones that should rise to the top, and that's the ones that should be the most important, the most impactful, etc. But what you're getting at is that, how do you determine what is the best piece of information, right? In this free market of information, very much in the spirit of capitalism, what's happened is it's not the best idea that wins. It's not the most credible. It's not the most well thought out or most validated or tested or data driven. It's the one that gets somebody to click on it. Right. And this capitalism nature of information, it's like we no longer produce information to build knowledge or wisdom. We produce information to build revenue and money because it gets more clicks. Is that kind of like, how do you think about that? Because those things aren't bad in and of themselves.
Yeah, I think it's true, but it's also always been true. So you only get the bad effects in particular conditions if the incentives are out of whack, essentially.
Okay.
And we've only had a few periods, I think, in our history where it's been this way. Probably the best, sort of the most analogous period in our history is the invention of the printing press, because again, you had a democratization of the publishing process, which resulted in a lot of new publishers entering the space and competing. But there was no mechanism essentially for filtering out anything that was produced in that period. And so if you look at the period that followed, what you see is witch hunts, inquisitions, I think 52 different religious wars all over Europe. And then you get the scientific method and peer review and the Enlightenment at the end, right? But so we are in this sort of transition period where people haven't quite adjusted to the new influx of information. Eventually, we'll figure it out, and what you said will be true, that capitalism is the best way to sort through this marketplace of ideas. But right now, our consumers are just not informed, and they don't have the toolkit, I guess.
That's interesting. So you're optimistic. You believe, and I know the work you do obviously speaks to this, but the belief is there's a solution here. It's not an inevitable thing, because you could look at what you just said and say human history has been a progression where we've always, as you said, it's always been about, what's the incentive if the incentives are out of whack, right? And you can argue that the incentives have always been out of whack. For people, it's always been about getting the most power. Maybe that's the simplest phrase to use that people have been after, whether it be through printing books or internet clickbait, like revenue ultimately comes back to power. So it's always been about getting power. But as we've progressed through human history, we've optimized for that. We've gotten better. We went from printing presses to televisions to the internet to social media to where we are today. So that's a gloomy picture, because that says we are just on a crash course with trying to optimize for the wrong thing, trying to optimize for power, which then causes the problem of information where you started with. But you think it sounds like that. No, that may be true, but we can self-correct. We did it with the printing press. We've done it with other things. We can fix it. what gives you that optimism? What doesn't make you think human history is doomed to this?
Well, I think that we've done it many times before. And let me give you the optimistic and the pessimistic angle,
okay.
Right? The optimistic angle is that printing press eventually leads to an enlightenment. The pessimistic angle is during those 52 religious wars that you have in the interim, the world might end, right? And so in our case right now, if we have religious wars, but this time with nukes, then we might not survive it. So a part of the urgency and why I switched to working on this problem instead of what I was doing before, which is almost the opposite to an extent. I was building lots of cameras and computer vision
more information
that produced a lot of information, right? So I switched to this side because I think that we can't afford to wait 200 years this time. We have to adjust faster. And I want to try to use technology to make that period during which we adjust to the new influx of information shorter. So that's both the optimistic and the pessimistic. If you think about any new media, like you could argue that the invention of the radio caused the first two world wars in some sense, right? Basically, the rise of totalitarian regimes in Europe followed propaganda on the radio that people just didn't learn how to filter yet. So we've always had these bad transition periods. The question is how to make them shorter.
Yeah, it gets to a question of like, what is the actual shape of the curve, if that's the right phrase to use? Like the way you're saying it, which I don't necessarily disagree with, is that it's like, it gets bad for a little bit and then we fix it. And then it gets bad and we fix it. Versus like, it's getting worse and worse and worse. And then like, we have like a little fix and then it gets worse. You know what I mean? Like, because you could argue that the radio is a good example. Like there's this philosophical drive for humans towards power. So there's always going to be a group, if not all of us, that is trying to optimize or almost in some ways weaponize different technologies and media towards our own end. And there's like regulation is not the right word, but there's regulation, there's fixes where we can address that. But it doesn't stop us from looking for a new thing then that's going to work even better. So even if we fix the internet issue, just using that as the one of today, or social media, it's like we're still on that same crash course. We're still heading towards that same end game.
Is it a crash course though? If you look at history as a whole, then it's a story of constant improvement, right? It's those periods of transition that look really bloody, but even if going back to the invention of the printing press, okay, you have a lot of wars in the interim, you cannot argue by the end of the 18th century that things are worse than they were, right? At that point, they become substantially better in absolutely every way. You have literacy, you have higher standards of living, you have growth everywhere, etc. So eventually, it seems like humanity is on the right course as long as it doesn't destroy themselves in these periods of transition.
Well, let me say something to that, Alex. I think that's a really good point. See, the other view of it, though, is that it's the double-edged sword of the position we find ourselves in as humans and with consciousness, right? To be able to create those improvements in literacy and medical innovation and all the things we've done just as a society to become better, to make it objectively better in many ways, where it was in the 18th century to where it is today, those things don't come for free. The only way you get those things is by pushing the limits, creating new things, creating new media, all different types of things that then can be exploited, that put us at risk. Because you could take the view you just said and say, yeah, there's a lot of truth to that. And you could take the view also and say, okay, in the 17th century, and you've alluded to it already, our capacity to cause human suffering was much smaller than it is today. So even if like some markers say we're better off today, there's other markers that say we're much worse. And the power to use propaganda to start World War II, where many more people died, right? You think about just even in Japan alone, when the nuclear bombs were dropped, the atom bombs were dropped, like it might be more like smaller, in theory, like smaller time periods in which they happen, but the potential for damage and suffering is much greater. So I wonder, is the story of human history improvement? It depends on the metrics you look at, I guess, is what it comes down to, right? And what's the most important metrics?